Welcome to another episode of the Information Addicts Podcast. My name's Cassidy. I'm an information addict, and this is my podcast where I explore information, ideas, and beliefs, and try to do those things more responsibly. Today I have a conversation with Adam, and I actually found Adam from watching a conversation he did with Paul Vanderklay. And I got far enough in the conversation that I realized I don't really want to sit on the sidelines and watch this. I'd rather just have a conversation with Adam in person. So I reached out to Paul, and he sent my information to Adam, and we were able to connect and have a conversation. And it was so lovely. We talked a lot about orthodoxy and sort of our path and experiences with it. Him still being evangelical Protestant and me converting to orthodoxy, but both having an interest in the ritual and the liturgy and sort of the tradition. But it kind of went all different ways, and we eventually started talking about Facebook and technology and the way those things integrate and change our lives. And it was very interesting. I hope you enjoy the conversation, and I hope you let me know what you think. All right, Adam, thank you so much for coming on and having a conversation with me.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So we've never actually had a conversation before.
No.
I saw you on Paul's channel. I watched a little bit of it, but I actually stopped because I knew, I'm like, okay, I think I want to talk to this person. So
No
why
kidding.
don't you give me a little background about who you are? I know you have some interest in orthodoxy, but just give me a little bit of the who are you story.
So kind of the same, I'll give you sort of the same background I gave Paul. Long story short, I'm 38. I've been married for, I think we got an anniversary coming up, so I don't want to get it wrong, 13 years. So 3 kids. I live in the same small town I grew up in. Our town is really heavily Lutheran. So I grew up in the Lutheran church up through about like college age. And that's when I really started to get interested in like the popular Christianity in the West, I guess, which at the time, was early 2000s. It's, Mark Driscoll and James McDonald and some of those big names. And so the theology that I got interested in, and then independently my wife also got interested in, was more along those lines than Lutheranism. So long story short, we ended up kind of sticking with the Lutheran church. I was pretty involved, with serving there, playing in, I play guitar. So I'm currently at like a non-denominational type church on the worship team there. And then, we did the same type of thing at the Lutheran church. But ultimately with the theological differences and, some of that stuff, we ended up moving to another church that is kind of like, almost like a mini mega church. Like for every Sunday we have 2 services. There's maybe 300 some people at each service. So it's not huge, but as small as it is, the production's really high. The music's like really dialed in, all of that kind of stuff. And then I actually currently serve on the elder board at that church, which is an interesting position for me to be in. And our lead pastor is very cool. We have actually some of these pretty deep theological conversations, and he really does know where I'm at in terms of, views of the church. And I guess that's one good thing about a non-denominational church like that is it's even written into the church constitution that like, here are our core beliefs. And as a member of the church, you should not teach against them. And so that leaves a little bit of room for some differences as long as you're not like, causing problems. Right. Whereas the Lutheran church was very strict. Like, this is the doctrine. If you don't believe exactly this doctrine, then you should not be taking communion with everybody else. And so we both have just been really drawn to orthodoxy recently from a lot of different angles, actually.
Okay.
Myself, I am really interested in the way that it seems to make more sense of the world. It's sort of a holistic view of the world. Very consistent with my first introduction to sort of tying some of these things together was Jordan Peterson's biblical series, which I still think is one of the best things he's ever done. Those are very, very good. And then also Jonathan Pageau obviously has some very good content in that regard. My wife does like that stuff, and we have these conversations. She sees things a lot. I don't know if it's a left brain, right brain thing sometimes, but just from a very relational perspective, some of the advice on suffering and things like that orthodoxy has to offer just seems a lot more consistent and I'm trying to think of a way to say it. It just makes sense in a way that it leaves room for some mystery in a way that modern Protestantism does not, which is really counterintuitive to me. That from the outside, you would think the Orthodox faith is the one that has all the dogma and the one that has no room to move. But it's some of these Protestant thinkers that have an answer down to, every little piece of minutia, exactly what Scripture says about this and exactly what you're supposed to believe. And so that's kind of, I'm being a little wordy about it, but that's more or less where we are right now.
Okay. Well, let's dig a little bit deeper into sort of like your initial like exploration of Protestantism with like Mark Driscoll and some of these sort of, young, restless, reformed kind of thinkers. What got you into that? What kind of drew you into that world as you kind of went from this Lutheran background to some of this more popular, at least at the time, popular like thinkers in that Christian world that were a little edgier?
I think it's hard to answer that honestly, because some of it I think is a cultural and a stylistic kind of thing. So as a musician, like some of the best musicians, and not just, across, the space of musicians, not just in the Christian world, but some of the best musicians are actually these musicians that are producing modern worship music. Like some of the best guitar players out there as a guitar player are modern worship guitarists.
Yeah.
And so I cannot, separate that element of admittedly selfishness from what really drew me to sort of that direction, because serving on the worship team in the capacity we do with the production level that we do, it's very, in a way, it's really fulfilling.
Yeah.
And I know that that's not an excuse. It's not to say that, that means we're in the right space. It's the right religion. But I think there was that element of it. Another thing was how practical their advice often was. And so growing up Lutheran, the church seemed very separate. It was a separate piece of your life from the rest of your life. And then people like, James McDonald was one that I listened to a lot. Mark Driscoll, I really almost hesitate to mention him because that name carries so much baggage right now.
Oh yeah,
but
especially with the podcast.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I use him as an example of somebody who really, whatever you believe about him, I think he genuinely believes that he is teaching out of the Bible in a biblical way and sharing that with people in a way that they can use on a day-to-day basis. Whereas, the church we were going to, where I live in Michigan, which is like really Midwest. And so culturally, we're very, like, it's very German. When you look at all the Lutheran churches that were planted, they're like all in this like Minnesota, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana sort of Midwest. And so there's a cultural element there that kind of gets baked into it all. And there was just a genuineness and an authenticity that I saw to some of those other pastors that I just hadn't seen acted out in the religion I grew up in.
Yeah. Driscoll's definitely, he is this kind of controversial figure because of certain things that he's done. And it's one of those things where you like look at him as a whole. It's like some things he says are, not bad necessarily, or even some of the things he says like that are edgy or sort of controversial. It's like, well, he's saying like relatively good things in this way that like doesn't quite feel comfortable or whatever. And I think with the sort of podcast, there's more backdoor, behind the scenes issues that are coming out that make it kind of uncomfortable. But there's like, I can recognize sort of that pull to his sort of style. It never drew me. It's funny. I didn't really know much about Mark Driscoll until the podcast came out. And I had heard his name a little bit because I used to live in Arizona, and he planted a church.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
In Arizona after he finished at Mars Hill. And so I knew someone who had knew his daughters or whatever. So I'd like heard the name, but I didn't really know much about him.
Right.
And then I listened to that podcast after like leaving the evangelical non-denominational church. And well, that was a whole thing for me, but
sure. No, that's interesting though. I remember, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
So that one of the last things I did at the Lutheran church we were at, this was when it was like 2012, 13-ish, it would have been. We had the old traditional Lutheran service, which is very much, organ and hymns and things like that. And then we had a contemporary service, and I was on the leadership committee to kind of construct this contemporary service. And it was interesting to come at it from different angles, because there's this tension of trying to keep, the divine liturgy and things like that, but then also being more contemporary, because Lutheranism is very much about liturgy, as Protestant as it is. And I remember, and when I say these things, I really try to be completely objective. Like this doesn't mean this is what I think now. This is just where my head was at the time. But I remember thinking, why would you stop in the 1500s and say that is what church needs to be? And ironically, I remember distinctly saying either orthodoxy is correct or the modern non-denominational movement is correct, but it has to be one of those, because I don't see a reason that you would stop culturally in 15 whatever and then say that that's what church properly is. Either church is what it has been for 2,000 years and orthodoxy has it right, or like what the modern non-denominational movement would say is we're carrying this legacy of Acts, where we're sort of missional in the culture. The mission statement of my church is actually culturally relevant, biblically rooted. And so it's this imperative of engaging in the culture, getting people to know Jesus, and it's very very evangelistic.
Yeah.
And so, and it's funny because I still think that is probably the case. I think one of those ends of the dichotomy is probably more, true than the other, but it's an interesting, it's kind of just coming full circle like that has been really interesting.
Well, that's a really interesting way to look at it, because I grew up in non-denominational churches. My dad had a Calvinist bent, but like we always just sort of went non-denominational. And throughout my life, like I've always considered myself a Christian, but probably at 18 is when I kind of shifted into something that like was very, like I took it on myself. And I never had like a strong opinion about denominations. It was like, there's probably one that's more right than the others, but like, I don't know. So like, I just got to like learn what it means to like follow this thing and understand it as best as I can. And I kind of went through deconstruction in college and tried to kind of reform that, and eventually came back to Christianity, but landed in that place where it's like, I don't know what denomination is, but like, I'm going to go back to at least something close to what I knew. And I ended up going into a very evangelical church that sounds very similar to what you're in now, very high production, like music. And it was aimed at college kids. And that was something I really liked too, because I went through this thing in college. And if I could potentially like help other college kids who were having the same sort of issues or, that kind of crisis that I did, like, it's always nice to have a support, to have somebody to walk with who's been through that. So if I could potentially be there in that like time of life, I'd like to do that. It's just like, I was way too old to be going there. Like it's very college age. It was not a bad thing that I was there, but it was sort of like me, I was 26, 27 at the time, and like a bunch of like 18 to 21 year olds. But there was something really drawing me to that, just because the people were very genuine. There was something very real about what they were doing and what they believed. You could just tell it was very earnest and genuine. And I'm a filmmaker, so to be able to be part of video production and events coordination and all of those things, like it was really exciting. Like there's something really tangible about that. And I kind of just fell into it, but coming back, it started that question of like, is this thing that I'm doing, this sort of modernist take of trying to make church culturally relevant and appealing to young people in sort of like a hip, cool way, helpful? Because I did not think it was inherently wrong, but I really struggled with that, especially with sort of the music and the way that it had the ability to kind of create a emotional pull towards something, or
Yeah.
the ability to throw yourself into something and chase a high, or even sort of fake it till you make it, where it's like, well,
Sure.
everybody else is like into this and
Absolutely.
jumping around. And it was just
Yeah.
that battle for a really long time. I had no idea about Orthodoxy. Like I've heard about Catholicism, and, I grew up knowing a bit about the Protestantism and like the denominational landscape, but nothing super strong. Like there was nothing embedded in me. And that's when I found Orthodoxy, which kind of got to the place where I found Orthodoxy right when I decided, okay, this church that I'm in is probably more detrimental to me than I've realized. And I just have to find somewhere else. I'm not going to run away from it, but I do think I have to be open to something else. And I found Orthodoxy, and it was just this eye-opening thing of realizing, oh, I have no idea what this is. I know about Catholicism, but I've never really looked or understood Orthodoxy. And as I started searching and unpacking it, the methodology and the way that they come to truth and the participation of church just made so much more sense to me than anything else ever did. And so it was sort of eventually I got to the place where it's even if I want to be Protestant, I can't, because I don't believe some of these Protestant dogmas that I used to. And that was the turning point of really taking the steps to convert. But that's really interesting to think of it that way, having that sense to say, hey, it's either this thing or this non-denominational adjusting thing, because in some ways that does make a lot of sense in the dichotomy of what the choices are.
Yeah, I think so. I honestly think that where the church we are in is very much the inevitable evolution of Martin Luther's ideas of, the sola scriptura, and, by grace alone, by faith alone, et cetera, et cetera. This evangelical doctrine of, by adopting the psychological state of believing in Jesus as your savior, now you're transitioned from someone who is not saved to somebody who is saved and is filled with the Holy Spirit. And so it's almost like getting people onto the team, and then you've done the work. If somebody converts, you've done the work. Your next job is to either convert somebody else or help other people convert other people. Right. And so if that is the goal, if it's getting people saved, if it's a very missionary oriented thing, then of course that's when you send missionaries out into the field in other cultures. They have to adopt that culture in order to engage with those people. And I think that evangelicalism, that's what we say we're doing, is when we're doing these things. It's funny you mentioned going to a church where you felt like you were too old to go to the church. I run into the same things, because as a musician, the worship team is filled with a bunch of young people. And I joke with my wife all the time, I am that Steve Buscemi meme with the skateboard, the how do you do, fellow kids? That is me all the way, because they're going to concerts and staying up super late, and I'm this old guy with 3 kids. But yeah, it's no, I know that struggle for sure.
I enjoyed it. I've always been a person who's been pretty adaptable, with friends. I have friends who are in their 50s and 60s, and people who are 18. So it wasn't that bad for me to be a part of it and participate. But there were certain things, I think, just being a little bit older and out of that age. I think for me, it was just a real mirror to myself at 21.
Yeah, interesting.
And so it was sort of hard to wrestle with the fact of hey, this used to be something that I would have embraced wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
And been so eager and excited to pursue and pour myself into and grow this thing. And now I feel like I see, I don't know if it was a crack or a distortion in it. And it was really hard to just take it in and accept it.
It's one of those things, once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
And then you realize more and more that there's no way my heart's getting back in this. I get what you're saying.
Well, and for me, it's it was 2-3 years of not having any other option, where it's I think I'm supposed to be here and participate in this, yet every Sunday and throughout the week, I'm wrestling with the ideas of how do I participate well in this? is this the right thing to be doing? Like, what are the unintended consequences of some of these things? And now kind of embracing orthodoxy in a more liturgical tradition, which I never thought I would be a part of. It's very wild that I'm like here, and I officially became Orthodox in October. So,
oh, nice. Congratulations.
thank you. Yeah, it feels good. But yeah, it's been like I have more words for it than I did then. I mean, for me, I started seeing it as like a lot of the non-denominational Protestant movements is aimed at being culturally relevant. So they adopt modern architecture and music and things that are going to be relevant. The problem is the minute you try to be relevant is the minute you've lost it, because culture changes so fast. And so you're constantly having to pivot and move and try to adjust. And it almost feels like we're buying into this consumerism model of like, let's make everything nice and neat for you in a way that you're going to like it and have it approachable. And that was sort of the struggle of like, I don't think that's inherently wrong to want to make people comfortable in a certain sense, to be open to something. But it opens up a door to something that I think could be really dangerous in a search for religious truth and like participation of what's convenient for me.
Oh, absolutely.
So that was like a big struggle for a long time. And then kind of as I started unpacking more of the history and sort of the way that everything broke down, that was a big part of sort of a breakdown for me, where recognizing when the Reformation happened and Luther broke off for Catholicism, he didn't mean to strip away the liturgy. He didn't mean to like stop all of these things that have eventually come through the non-denominational, Protestant projects. And that was something too that I had to wrestle and reckon with, where it's like, you've got people talking about icons and the veneration of Mary or child baptism as things that are heretical. And it's like, well, if we're talking about what the church was at the beginning, that like you have to wrestle with the fact that most people throughout the history of church have believed those things were important to the faith. And you are the one that has the sort of niche opinion on this.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's hard in my mind. It's hard to wrestle with that fact and recognizing, religion is not something we choose it to be. We have to get back to the thing that it actually is and what it's meant to be and what it's asking, whether it's Mormonism, Islam, or any type of Christianity. And yeah, I couldn't help but see that there might be a huge misunderstanding in the way that, what Luther meant to do through the Reformation to where we are now. And like, there's a lot of dogmas and sort of rhetoric that come through the Protestant world that get accepted as truth. But I don't know. I started seeing the cracks in it, and when you start seeing the cracks, it's hard to forget it.
No, 100%. I totally get it, because coming from exactly that background, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is what we were a part of. And aside from the Wisconsin Synod, which I think is even more conservative, we were about the most conservative Lutheran denomination there was, to the point where the denomination itself had like internal issues, because some churches were adopting contemporary kind of stuff and other churches saw that as anathema, like you really should stick to the liturgy. Right. And so honestly, I think it would be less of a tension had we not moved churches, because we could get, that idea. I would probably still have trouble with it now that I think about it, because you're supposed to be in doctrinal agreement to do communion. And I don't think I would be at this point with some of the, some of the things. No big issues. And I know plenty of people that, don't have an issue. They take communion, no problem. But I really try to respect those things.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting though. Because I think you're right. I think people see, I actually said that in a recent meeting at church, but what we're doing as a church is so new to church history. Like it's from the 70s, basically, which is, the Jesus music movement and stuff like that started in California, and then, go into the culture. And I think it has, college campuses and things like that. But what we're doing is actually pretty new. And, throughout the history of the church, and I know you can make this argument, and I think it's the best argument that you can make, is that we are trying to look like the earliest church from the 1st and 2nd century, because we're jumping into the culture. But beyond that, it's really, really hard to make a case that you're carrying this tradition. And for me, it's a hard tension that my wife and I live in, because we jumped from the Lutheran church to the one that we're in now, the non-denominational one. And we lost some relationships, mostly because we didn't really handle it well. We weren't really, I'll take ownership of all this stuff, but it was kind of like, we just, kind of jumped ship because we were a little bit discontent and stuff like that. So part of what we're doing now is like, I think there's some value, at least for me, or I'm telling myself this, and going more slowly and not just jumping from one thing to another thing, because I don't want to do this again. You know what I mean?
Oh, totally.
I don't see that happening. I honestly don't. But and the other thing, like you mentioned too, there's a certain genuineness and authenticity to some of these people that you get to interact with. And it's hard for me to discount that, especially being able to serve as an elder alongside other people who, we're spending 45 minutes in prayer for people for the church body and things like that. So there's some fruit there. And I don't have an answer to that. I don't think it means, we're necessarily doctrinally correct or anything like that, but it does give me a little bit of encouragement that it's not nothing. It's not just a cultural exercise, branded as Christianity.
Right.
But at the same time, I don't want to, ignore those cracks that you mentioned earlier.
Right. Well, I've had a hard struggle of figuring out how to frame it all in my head, because I look at it when I was a Protestant. I wouldn't say I was following a different God, or that I wasn't a true Christian. Like, I do think I was still committed to the same God. And I do think the spirit of whatever's in Orthodoxy lies in other denominations too. So it's not that, like, I personally think, like, if it's not Orthodoxy, like, you're not a Christian.
Right.
That's not how I see it. I do think that other denominations are less correct, at the very least. But yeah, it's sort of this weird thing where it's like, I would never sway someone from going to a Protestant church if it was something they were convicted in and like truly believed was like the full thing. Because I was there and I needed that time to be in that place to learn the things that I needed to do. But I got to the place where I couldn't be an advocate or identify as a Protestant.
That is an issue I struggle with, because when our church does classes on very specific doctrinal things, like what does baptism mean? What does communion mean? I don't feel great being a part of those things, because we have, there's the certain sort of Calvinistic, I wouldn't call it Calvinist, but sort of this, I say lukewarm, that sounds more derogatory than I mean it to, but this sort of lukewarm Calvinism baked into this doctrine that, and I don't know church history well enough to know exactly where the doctrine originated, but it's a very soft view of the sacraments. I've once heard the bread and the juice referenced during a communion thing, and that was really, really cringe for me to hear that, because it's, Welch's grape juice, and it's bread and wine. It's not, bread and juice, but
that's what it is in a lot of churches. It's crackers and Welch's.
oh, that's what it is in our
You know,
church as well. So moving from,
right?
I
And
actually
so
miss that.
yeah.
Yeah, no, and that's what I mean. It's just such a low view of that sacrament, where
Yeah.
it's, the pinnacle of the divine liturgy in the Orthodox Church. It's so, flipped upside down.
Yeah, and I don't think they mean it in any disrespect at all. And
No.
it's I think it's when you lose sight of the history and sort of the heart of the thing that you came from, which I think is what happened in a large sense when Protestantism broke off
Mhm.
and kind of defined what it means to be church in their own terms.
Mhm.
It's to a certain sense. It cut off the arteries to like where the thing originated. And it makes so much sense why it morphed the way that it did. And I don't take offense in that view of sort of the wine and the crackers, or the juice and the crackers, because I recognize where it's coming from. If you really think that there's just something symbolic about
Yeah.
it, and there isn't some value in the liturgical practice and the actual participation with bread and wine for a reason.
Yeah. No, and I
It's
don't
still
want to.
sacred
Yeah.
to them, but it almost anything can be anything,
Yeah, no, that's 100%. And I don't mean that to, I don't want to disparage anything that,
Yeah.
any of these churches, including my own, are doing. I think
Yeah.
that, we have a very profound respect for communion when we do it. And it's not, I'm talking about it from a purely doctrinal perspective, what the view of that is. And it's very much, I think, just like you said, with the Reformation, Luther's, the big things in Lutheranism are the solas, the sola scriptura. Well, I probably used to know all five, but sola scriptura, sola gratia, sola fide, and two other ones. But, grace alone, faith alone, scripture alone, the other two. If that is your standard, there is no lens necessarily through which to interpret those things. So you get to read scripture how, Calvin reads scripture, or Zwingli, or whoever. Like, that's the guy. Like, we say we follow scripture, but we really follow Zwingli's interpretation of scripture, or Calvin's interpretation of scripture.
Right. That's so true. And this was another thing that kind of helped me get to the place where the methodology of orthodoxy made more sense, where who is going to know more about the meaning of the original text? Calvin, who came how many, hundreds of years after the church, or the church fathers, who were like, Polycarp was a disciple of John, right? Or something.
Yeah, I think,
I think that one of them, I think it's John, but I could be wrong. But it's like, if we're talking about who has a better sense of what it meant in that time, in that place, wouldn't it make more sense that the church fathers and their interpretations closer to the actual like life and teachings of Jesus when it was being spread and started have a better grasp and understanding than someone who has all of this cultural space and time and is interpreting through a lens of Westernism, or I don't know what you would call it, but that's where that was one of the things that kind of hit me. And the other two kind of big ones that made me not Protestant, I wouldn't say convinced me of orthodoxy, but made me not Protestant, was sola scriptura and the grace and grace alone. These two things that get said so often in Protestantism, and recognizing there are verses in the Bible that sort of make an argument against sola scriptura, where it says, and I don't remember, it's in one of Paul's letters, but I remember I was right after I found orthodoxy, I was reading through Paul's letters and seeing this verse and was like, oh my gosh, I've never seen that before. But it was like, follow the things that have been handed down to you in word and in deed, which right there, it's like, oh, you mean like tradition?
Right.
Crap. I've never noticed that
Mm-hmm.
before. And then the idea of grace and grace alone. Nowhere in the Bible does it actually say grace and grace alone. It does say we are saved by grace, but the grace and grace alone is this Protestant dogma that, and I don't know all the history from it, but what makes sense to me, at least, is that it was this phrase coined and propagated to fight against Catholicism, which was the work-based faith. And I was like, whoa, okay. These two things are starting to like crack. And there were things about the Catholic version of, the faith works dichotomy that didn't make sense to me, and why I just never moved towards Catholicism. But that orthodoxy view of it made so much more sense to me, where it's like, it's two sides of the same coin, where like we are saved by grace, but there is also this saving act in doing the works. And like, we are all on this path of being saved. Like, and there's a lot more that goes into that. Nathan Jacobs actually had a talk with Hank Hanegraaff where he explained it like so well. And it made so much sense to me and clicked, where I started going, I don't think I believe that anymore.
Yeah. No, I get it 100%. I think the way it's typically framed in my church, in a modern non-denominational church, is there's salvation, which again, you believe in Jesus as your Lord and Savior, and then you receive the Holy Spirit. That's one thing. And then if the ones that have like a hard doctrine are like, you need to recognize the date and time that you made that decision, and that's the date and time that you were saved. And then this other piece of it is what they call sanctification, which is, now it's really just kind of the sanctification part of it just hangs out in this nebulous space. It's not really tied to anything.
Right.
It's more like it's evidence that you're saved or something like that. But there are people that do some pretty bad stuff and then repent and then do some pretty bad stuff again. And I've always had trouble with that doctrine, especially there's that verse, and I wish I could remember what letter it was in, but where Paul says to work your salvation out with fear and trembling. That resonated with me from like a very young age, and it just did not fit with any Protestant doctrine that I had been exposed to, because it was like, you should know that you're saved. You don't have anything to fear and tremble about. That was probably one of those, little cracks that you referenced earlier, but one that really resonated with me for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird. You mentioned earlier that orthodoxy would seem from the outside the more rigid view. And what I found in exploring it is exactly the opposite in a lot of senses, where they have a trust in the thing that's been handed down to them, and there are certain dogmas and things that they hold to be true for the church, for all people, all times. Yet there is so much more sort of openness to this mystery, and so much openness to like that moving towards the sacraments and the rituals we do as a group to help us in that moving towards what it means to be truly human, what it means to be saved and redeemed and all of these things, and what it means to be like God and in participation with him. And there is something about the Protestant view that either goes two ways, more liberal or more conservative, where it's everything's okay, just ask Jesus for forgiveness, and a much more lax, a lack of certain seriousness or reverence, or hyper legalism, where it's like, well, this is what it means to do all of these things, and if you don't follow all of these rules and all of these things, then you're failing. And there's this fear mechanism that goes behind it. And somehow orthodoxy is like this middle ground, where it's like there's a reverence and there's a fear and there's a structure, yet there's this like huge acceptance of the sovereignty of God, and just the belief in him meeting us where we're at, and that path of a lifelong, long-term turning towards God and being healed and being transformed into new humans, that I think solved a lot of that problem that you were talking about for me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's fun. I mean, we at our home, I mean, we go to this non-denominational church. I'm serving as an elder at this non-denominational church. Our home, like, we've got icons. We do the morning and evening prayers. We do like the kids' Bible stories. We get them from I forgot the name of the group. It's like the big group that produces Orthodox material.
Ancient faith.
Yes. Yeah. So we have like the kids' Bible, the kids' version of prayers. So we're kind of, I don't want to cheapen it at all, because I know that this is not necessarily living like the Orthodox life under the guidance of a spiritual father and all of that stuff. But that stuff, that doc just seems, it seems so much more authentic than a, random devotional written by a mega pastor that lives in a 750,000 or, $7 million house, whatever I just recently saw. But it's, there's something about the authenticity of that ancient faith that you just don't get from these very westernized pastors living a very westernized, successful life. And not to dump on anybody that has a lot of money. I don't intend to do that at all, but it is, there's just, something about that seems a lot more authentic.
Well, there's a level of authenticity because it's not placating to the things that culture is pressuring it into. So it because it holds to these more ancient rituals and practices, like, it automatically gets set apart because it feels something otherworldly. Like, you walk into an Orthodox church and you can't help but feel, with the icons and the way the church is, like, a sense of reverence, whether you're believe in this thing or not. But there's a certain awe to the beauty in which the place is constructed, and you actually feel like you're walking into a place where people meet God, as opposed to some of these warehouses, churches, with no disrespect at all, but there's just such a difference. And like, I've spent most of my life in warehouse churches.
Yeah,
you know?
right.
And I have so much respect and appreciation for all of the things it gave me. But it's really hard to go back. Like, the first Orthodox service I had, kind of like, for me, it was an immediate,
Wow.
like, oh, there's something about this that I want to know more about, and I don't feel comfortable calling myself Protestant. But it took like 2 years of really kind of poking, prodding, trying to get my mind around, like, is this the thing that I should go into? Which is actually very helpful, because Orthodoxy, and I don't know if you've talked to a priest or been to an Orthodox church, but
Have not yet.
they're very slow people. So your spirit, and where I don't want to jump into anything, so I'm moving very slowly, that's very Orthodox. And so for me, that was helpful too, of just saying, I need to take my time and make sure, if I'm going to commit to this, like, it's the right thing to commit to, or and move towards. But after that first service in Orthodoxy, anytime I went back to a Protestant service, it just wasn't the same. Like, it just felt, it didn't feel as deep. It didn't feel as wide and vast. And it felt like explored territory. And I've talked with my friend Shelly a couple times. I met her on Paul's Vanderklay's Discord, but she was a missionary from West Africa, and then ended up coming to Orthodoxy. And I sent her an article that I found on some Orthodox site. I don't even remember which one, but it was this missionary who was talking about his life as a missionary and then coming into Orthodoxy, and how he kind of talked about that shift from Protestantism to Orthodoxy. It's like, I traded good for better.
Yeah. Interesting.
And I couldn't go back. Like, once you've tasted better, it's really hard to, it's hard to accept just good.
Yeah. That's,
Um,
I get it 100%, because the attitude that we have now, I think, at the church we're at is completely different. So when I was in the Lutheran church looking at like being really interested in the non-denominational stuff on that leadership committee for constructing the service, I was very vocal about, promoting that idea. And we need to move in this direction. Now it's like, I'm just keeping my mouth shut, because there's nothing that, like, this church is serving the community well. It's a great, spiritual place for a lot of people to kind of to lean on and get support and things like that. And I really think that there's some fruit there, but I'm not, I don't want to push it and try to change it in a different direction. I just don't think that would be, it would be, I think it would be pointless, because there'd be friction. But then at the same time, like, it's never going to be 100% the thing that, that we're looking for, which I think, like you mentioned, the Orthodox Church. And it's, I can't, I have not been to a service, but even just interacting with, getting like the daily prayers and just icons around the house, and to now it's more like just a reminder to, say the Jesus prayer a couple times or something like that.
yeah.
Again, this is like free for all, grab bag stuff we're doing right now. But even just the little like gems in those actions, I think color our perspective of Protestantism enough that the services do feel different. And so I'm not equating that. Like I said, we haven't been to a service, but I can imagine, like, just that little glimpse. It was probably, times 1,000 having gone to the service like you did.
Do you know Frederica Matthew Green at all?
Yes, I'm actually like a third of the way through one of her books.
Which one?
Let me see. I do audiobooks. So
Okay.
it is, or no, I'm sorry. I'm thinking of, I do know who you're talking about. This is Eugenia.
Okay.
No, I'm sorry. I do know who you're talking. I'm thinking of the wrong person. So
Well,
the book that I'm in is Thinking Orthodoxy. That's a different author.
Yeah. So she wrote a book called Facing East, and it was one of the books a friend of mine recommended to me when I was like, okay, I want to take Orthodoxy more seriously. What should I read?
Mhm.
He's like, read this. Like, he's very hesitant.
Yeah.
He's like, maybe the church fathers, maybe this, but really you should just go to a service, because they're
Yeah.
very
Interesting.
participation first, which
Mhm.
is actually hugely beneficial in like my being able to kind of understand and take in the theologies and the differences, which is not a very Protestant mindset. They're very much propositional first, truth
Exactly.
first.
Yeah.
But Orthodoxy, it's not as much about like knowing all the right things about theology and having everything lined up in your mind. It's like, well, here are, participate, go to church, and then while you're doing that, learn some stuff alongside, and together they kind of click. But she has she wrote a book called Facing East, and it was sort of her introduction to Orthodoxy, and then sort of a year in the life of being an Orthodox priest Orthodox priest wife.
Because her husband wasn't he a Episcopalian minister or something like that?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's true. And so she writes the first chapter. She writes, and I really haven't gotten this far in the book, but the first chapter just struck me, because she writes about how her husband goes in and he sees the incense, he hears the bells, he senses truth, and she's standing there and her feet hurt. And she's just like, I didn't get it. And a lot of women don't get Orthodoxy, where, it's just harder for them to get into the liturgy and the things that are presented like at the face of it. And I don't quite know why that is, but I've heard that a lot of people say it's sort of more of a masculine. It's got a more masculine energy, and males are more drawn to it. But for me, the way she described her husband's experience was exactly my first experience with Orthodoxy. And, I still took my time in kind of poking and prodding, getting there, because I didn't want to just throw myself into something and fully commit that wasn't grounded and felt really true to me. But that was one of the big things that kept me going, is just like recognizing like there was something about the experience and this like tangible feeling that felt like nothing else that I'd ever been a part of. And the people that I meet felt like people I'd never met before. And the theologies and the ideas they were giving me put things in place that didn't happen in the same way Protestantism did.
Yeah.
Even though Protestantism at one point in my life completely made sense to me. Like I could get it in my head and understand it. And it just kind of like fell apart for me.
Mhm.
And I don't know, it's hard to find a balance. And I try to be careful when I talk about it, because I don't want to like trash on Protestantism and say
No, not
that,
at all. I know exactly, like
Um,
without words, I know exactly what you're saying, because I'm there too, living in the Protestant world, and I'm not going to convert anybody or anything like that. I know exactly where you're coming from.
well, it was easier for me to criticize the Protestants when I was a part of them, because it felt like a
Mhm.
self-audit where it's like, why do we do things this way? What do we
Yeah,
do?
exactly.
And then when I dropped it, I was like, ooh, I
Yeah.
don't think I can say the things that I say anymore, at least not in the way that I say them, because it has a different tone and it's taken a different way. And like, I want to respect, the people who participate that and the project. I think it was successful in the way that it was for a reason, to teach us something as human beings. But yeah,
I
it's really hard to feel like, you know, uh, comfortable advocating and saying, yeah, it's great. Cause I look
yeah.
back and think, it was probably a lot more harmful to me than I recognize.
Mhm. I get it. I think what the most peace I've been able to come to with it, I think it might have been Father Josiah Trenum. If it wasn't him, it was one of the other, voices on YouTube, described that modern church as something akin to a large Bible study. And so viewing it like that, I feel a little bit better about it, because it's not, 180 degrees wrong. It's just not complete. That's sort of the piece I've made with it, of being able to, I mean, there are some things that are wrong, because I don't discount that, but on the whole, it's like you said, they're not worshiping a different God. It's, everybody is ideally pursuing Christ. It was another father, I can't think of his name right now, but it's a podcast, who said something like, Christ, it's hard to say. It was something like, we can't say where Christ isn't, but Christ shines brightest in the Orthodox Church. And I thought that was
Right.
really a great, something. It's not like I'm going to and supporting this completely heretical enterprise that's, steering people toward hell, or something
Right.
like that. Um, I was going to ask too, when you said that you immediately recognized the beauty and the meaning, and in the incense and the sites, and everything in the Orthodox Church, do you think that has anything to do with your background as a filmmaker? So somebody who's used to looking at meaning and what's behind the objects in a space, rather than just this is the material thing that's here in front of me.
I don't know. That's an interesting question. I've never thought about it that way. It's hard to say, because I mean, I had gone to a Catholic service when I was like 21, and I was like in film school at that time, and I didn't get it. Right? Like I'm
Okay.
not bummed down. Like, what is this? Like, it's fine for you, but I don't get it. I think for me, it was more my digging into biblical literature
Okay.
that I think started to click things in and like heighten things. Because when I started deconstructing, I started reading through the Bible, like in a year. Well, the first year I did it twice in a year, and then after that I kind of did it
Wow.
once every year for like 3 or 4 years. And this year I've stopped because I think it's time to slow down. But I got really into, biblical literature, and I did a lot of, I consumed a lot of resource with the Bible Project, which I still think what they do is super, super great. I mean, I think their perspective of the biblical literature is a lot more orthodox than a lot of Protestants. I would probably say there are certain things that are differing, but even when I hear some of like the things that they talk about in the patterns when I rewatch them, there are certain things that seem to line up and make more sense with orthodoxy than other things that I heard in other Protestant circles. And so I think my participation with that sort of content and recognizing the patterns and sort of the literary structures and the hyperlinks that are going in through all these things, and reading some of these books of the Bible that people, like a lot of Christians, have never read.
Yeah.
It started to open my mind to like, because I remember trying to think, I'm looking at the incense and I'm just thinking hevel, hevel, all's hevel, and just like, and just recognizing like, I don't know what this means, but I know there's a deep meaning, especially looking at some of like the rituals in the Old Testament with the temple times and the way that they did things, and, digging deeper into the history and understanding what those things actually meant. It was like, oh, okay, I see something going on here.
Yeah.
And the biggest clincher for me, I think, in kind of connecting those things happened 2 years later, like right before I converted to Orthodoxy. I started going to Shabbat services with one of my Jewish friends.
Oh, cool.
And it was unbelievable to me how similar that service was to the Orthodox service. And for me, it was like, if Christianity was born out of Judaism and Jesus came to fulfill the law, not to abolish it, like, shouldn't there be some like connection and respect for the thing it came from? And it was so lost in the non-denominational Protestant worlds I came from. Like, if I had just come from Protestantism to these Shabbat services, and they were like the more traditional liturgical services, I'd have no context. But I felt at home after being in Orthodox services consistently for a year. And it was like, wow, okay, there's this huge connection. There's something at least parallel to these two things. And so yeah, I would say it's probably more my interest in comparative religion and biblical study that probably heighten those things, and strictly my filmmaking bent. But I think it does help in a certain sense because I tend to think more symbolically, naturally, I guess.
Yeah.
And so to have that embodied in the faith and the practices, there's something kind of interesting and beautiful to me.
No, I think that's 100% right. I really, have you read Matthew Pageau's book? So it's Jonathan Pageau's brother.
Yeah,
wrote a book called Language of Creation. It's phenomenal.
I haven't read it, but it's actually
on
that end table over there. So I haven't had a chance to read it, but
yeah, it completely, I mean, I knew of, I knew abstractly what thinking symbolically meant, but that book is really what just kind of totally almost reformatted my worldview, which is interesting because, like you said, there's truth that you can believe propositionally, and I think that's a consequence of the Enlightenment, is we think that things that you can believe propositionally is the description of things that are either true or false. But if it's true, then you can believe it propositionally. But there really is truth that has to be embodied. It's not. I have these conversations with a friend of mine all the time who's sort of a Christian, sort of kind of deconstructing, leaning toward atheism. But we have some pretty genuine conversations. And I said that to him, like, faith is not, it's not making your, like, figuring out which direction to go and then going in that direction. It's picking a direction and moving in that direction. And so you might not, you probably shouldn't know exactly, everything about it and the
Right.
consequences of it and the reasons why, things like that. Um, but I'm interested in that perspective a lot because I spent the first, most of my life as a very, analytical kind of, but like I have a degree in biochemistry, and then I'm a dentist actually as a day job, and I'm currently in a master's program for computer science. So it's all like it's all just really super hyper analytical
Yeah.
stuff, and it's really fascinating to go through some of these computer science classes and see the symbolism that underlies some of that, and it's really fascinating. And like I said, like I tell my friends, I have like a medieval view of the world, but it makes more sense to me than this enlightenment rationalism.
Right. I think we get really disconnected to the fact that a lot of ancient people didn't see a difference between literal and metaphorical truths.
Right,
Like
yeah.
they were the same. And it's such a modern idea to separate them out and, parse them apart in different boxes. I think it's made it really hard to think about these things well, especially religious questions, because now we're all of these like disembodied boxes. And I have my science box, and I have my religion box, and I have
Exactly,
my
yeah.
social media box or whatever have you.
Hmm.
And that you separate them out, where I've started to recognize the integration of all of these things are so important. And you can't you can't have you can't have all of these boxes in separate places. Like there are times to look at them separately and like understand things, I suppose, but really the world should be about integrating it and finding a lens that makes the
Hmm.
most connections, not fragments things. And Western thought is just a lot about fragmentation and like pulling it apart and isolation. Um, and it's really hard because I would not say I'm an analytical person by nature. I'm much more of like an intuitor, a feeler,
Hmm.
and like,
Yeah.
kind of like that. I'm an artist very much at heart, but I have a very analytical father, and recognize the power that side of myself can help in like finding direction. And so I think, especially as I was going through deconstruction, I really poured myself into sort of a more analytical frame,
Hmm.
learned how to speak the language of logic, and
Yeah, yeah,
dove really deep into philosophy and comparative religion and apologetics and all of these things that are,
yeah,
you know, facts, figures.
yeah,
Put
exactly.
my feeling aside. And I think orthodoxy was the first thing that helped me embody all of it, where it took
Hmm.
this sort of propositional part of myself and said, okay, it's good, but give it a back seat and like put beauty first, participate, trust your intuitions. Because for me, that's what faith is. It's trust. It's not knowing all the answers or, um, all about belief, but it's like trust in something bigger than yourself without that 100% certainty.
Hmm.
And so for me, it was really getting back into trusting myself, but like trusting the thing that's bigger than me to
Hmm.
put solid stones under my feet. Um, and yeah, I don't know. It's just been much more of an integrated view in orthodoxy, because there is so much belief in like the spiritual and the physical are connected, and
Hmm.
the way that we can take facts and symbolism and all of these things and weave them together and recognize there's truth in both, and they point us to see the world like in a more holistic way if we can integrate them well.
Yeah, I think that, to me, I think that is w- one of the most, if not the most significant thing about Jordan Peterson's work is reconciling, and not even reconciling, but just recognizing the scientific analytical coexisting, or even existing, as a consequence of the meaning underneath it. Because when you hear him speak, it's, he'll talk about the way your eye is constructed, with a center point as a fovea and the number of neurons in that versus the rest of your eye, in the same breath as talking about how you direct attention, and that automatically makes it so you can't pay attention to the other things around you. And to me, that connected a lot of dots. It checked a lot of boxes. It's unfortunate because he's become this very controversial figure. And I
Yeah.
think we have this idea in the West, I think it's a consequence of the media, that the most significant thing about somebody is the most visible thing about that person. And I think he's somebody who is not that. I mean, he came to, popularity because of the Bill C-16 thing or whatever it was. And,
Right.
owning the libs on YouTube and all that kind of stuff. And, I think his academic work is really pretty incredible. John Vervaeke is another one I've been following quite a bit lately as well,
Yeah.
mostly thanks to Paul. Paul's awesome.
Yeah, he is. No, the funny thing is I was never a huge Jordan Peterson fan. I saw the most that I've seen him is his sort of political stuff.
Right. And that's like the least, yeah.
The least interesting. I know everybody's
It
like,
is.
you need
It
to
really
watch the
is.
biblical series. And I'm like, okay, it's just not salient to me. So
Yeah, right.
so it's hard. And like, I think for me, it's my interests have been in other places. So I'm sure eventually I will get there. But I don't have any issue with him necessarily, but it wasn't like this like light bulb like it has been for a lot of people who watch
It
Paul.
really is. Yeah. No, it's interesting.
But no, I've loved how Paul is able to integrate a lot of different things and take what Jordan Peterson says and sort of he weaves things together in such an interesting way. And I think he's so people first that like you can tell like this is what he's doing is aimed at trying to help people understand and gain more meaning and dive deeper into what it is to live well and have a purposeful life. And that's really at the core of what we're doing with all of these questions, whether you're doing it in the field of science, philosophy, comparative religion, whatever. Like we're all trying to figure out what it is to live well and like have a purpose and what we should be pointing at. And I think this corner of the internet is doing a really good job at opening up the doors to have more external like opposing faith dialogues about those things and all different worldviews, faith worldviews and sort of atheist agnostic worldviews as well, in a way that isn't about always winning, but like recognizing the journey is complicated and we're all on it and seeing different things and experiencing different things. And I know I'm very hopeful for it. And honestly, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful it can bring at least a more awareness to Orthodoxy, because that's how I found it. I found Orthodoxy through Paul's channel and then the Discord.
Nice.
Nathan Jacobs.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, Nathan Jacobs was the first one who sort of planted the seeds in my mind, and I saw him from Paul's channel. And then,
that's cool.
I was on the Discord and just meeting all these Orthodox people, and I'd never met an Orthodox person in my life, but now like, I get to introduce to Orthodoxy, and it's Orthodox after Orthodox after Orthodox. And I have found so much peace with the conversion and the change and shift in my mindset
awesome.
from Orthodoxy. But even if someone doesn't get all the way there, I think there's something to be offered to understanding at least where Christianity started and how it might be able to help some of these other projects in different denominations of Christianity trying to move forward and do that in a healthy way. Because, all these denominations have blueprints of, how to live well, how to move towards Christ, how to embody the scriptures and the traditions in whatever way you can. And some are more effective than others. And I personally think that Orthodoxy has the most effective way. But it doesn't mean I discard everything I learned from Protestantism. I still listen to Protestant contemporary music. I still listen to online sermons and, things that I find helpful. But I just think that, there's a place for those things. And I don't think it's in the Sunday service.
Yeah.
But I thought it was very interesting you saying it's like a Bible study, because that's, in a lot of ways, that's what it is. Liturgy is so different than the Protestant frame of their liturgy. Like the divine liturgy is mostly a prayer service with like a 15-minute talk, and then more prayer and communion. And Protestantism is like worship music, hour-long lecture,
Hmm.
a little bit of prayer, more music, and maybe communion, once a month, or,
Yeah, once a month, somewhere in there.
something. And so it's just a different liturgy. And yeah, there are helpful things in it. I don't think it's all detrimental. But is it the most useful blueprint to
Right.
like having a healthy engagement with spirituality? That's the
I think
question we're all
that's,
asking.
yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that goes right along with what you said about, that ethos of kind of going a little bit slower and making, contemplating things. And I think these conversations are definitely a part of that. Like, it's just trying to steep the culture in the truth, and the truth will shine. I mean, the truth will eventually win out. If these ideas are bad, they're going to get, competed out. I think it's interesting too. Like, a lot of people are really hungry for this type of conversation, this deeper conversation. I did, it was like 3 or 4 weeks ago, I did a podcast with another dentist on YouTube, and he's an Indian guy. He's a Sikh. And I didn't know this till we like touched on it a little bit in the podcast. He hit, the record button on Zoom to end it. And then we stayed on Zoom for like another hour
Yeah.
talking about religion, Christianity. He was sharing with me like the legends of like the gurus and how that all came about, and why he's never cut his hair in his life. And I mean, it was a really, I told him, I was like, we need to do this again and like talk about this stuff. Like, I know it's completely off the wall, but there's a random guy who's not even like engaged in this space on YouTube. He hadn't really even heard of some of the, people I asked him about, but still, it's just like, there's a depth that I think people are hungry for that we're not getting in this, consumerist society.
Right. Well, and I think there's a big reason why you are seeing deconstruction start to happen in the evangelical world, because you're having a lot of kids and people in my generation being told what to believe without a real exploration of how to come to a why, or even the why at all.
Hmm.
And so, you run into that, and you kind of, it opens up the door for a faith spiral, and, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, or on the other hand, kind of being super dogmatic and doubling down on the things to kind of hold the things in your head. And there's so many people who don't know how to talk about, faith, religion, or, even like politics, or some of these big things that we find super important, because we were told not to.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think we're all kind of struggling to figure that out. And I think that's what's happening a lot with some of like the extremes on both the right and the left politically, of people
Hmm.
recognizing, morality, the way that we participate in societies, and the laws that we put in are like hyper important, and like they
Yeah.
have to start talking about it, but it doesn't it doesn't always come out the most helpful and healthy way. And I know that happened for myself as well, kind of going through these things and stumbling through how to be better at like really pursuing these questions. But
Yeah.
it is funny how many conversations I've had outside of, and this is why I actually started this podcast, because I used to work in a comedy club as a server. And we would, after we would get off a shift, we'd go down to like the bar two doors down, go to happy hour, and I would just sit and talk with people all night about philosophy, religion, all of
Yeah.
these things. I'm sipping my water, everybody else is like, just drinking away, and just having these conversations about like people so hungry to talk about religion and all these things, but unwilling to like step into a church.
Yeah.
And at that point, I recognize why they wouldn't want to.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I don't know if you're gonna like it,
No, I think that's exactly it. Like, religion, it'll poke through somewhere. Like, the political dichotomy now is very religious on both sides.
yeah.
I mean, there's ritual, it's
Yeah.
it's there. And I think, I mean, just like we were talking about, just to kind of put forward these ideas that you don't have to like immediately join a team like that, or there can be some uncertainty in the religion that you grew up with. Because like you said, deconstruction, like the answer to deconstruction is not, apologetics so these kids can continue to hold these ideas in their head. I think that it's more, there's an uncertainty that you can live in without throwing everything away. And yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see like what our our kids' generation has to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting process. And my opinion will probably continue to change as I
Mhm.
keep
No,
moving
absolutely.
forward in this like sort of reconstruction journey. But it's hard for me to say that apologetics doesn't have some place in it, because for me it was helpful in a sense.
Oh, for me, it was huge. That was like my big push of like, wow, I think Christianity is actually true. I should
Yeah.
take this seriously.
Right. But it's also this, I have this love-hate relationship where like it was very helpful and beneficial to me. And I see a super genuine sort of motivation for the creation of apologetics works and,
Mhm.
ministries and all those things. Yet so many people see it as this catch-all, like,
Yeah.
ultimate thing that's going to stop. Well, if we just give them the right information, it's like,
Yeah.
well, it's more than just giving the right information. It's also, there's something about the right participation
Mhm.
and the willingness to explore the information with someone without force feeding them the answer you want them to have.
Yeah. Right.
Because and Sean McDowell said this, and it really resonated with me, with this idea that if you're believing what's true, you don't have anything to fear.
Right.
And so it's like, well, yeah, so okay, let's search answers. And if
Mhm.
I'm believing what's true, then it'll show itself. If not, well, that's okay. I can replace it with something that is
Yeah.
true. And like recognizing I'm not going to have all of the answers. And
Mhm.
like there does become a level of trust in some of these things. And I know I've kind of gotten a little more uh, frustrated with the participation of apologetics in sort of these acts of conversion,
Yeah.
where it's like, I get it. And I'm not going to say you're wrong. And if you feel like that's the way you need to convert, like, go for you, good for you, go for it. I'm not going to
Mhm.
stop you. But I almost think an engagement with apologetics should be more of a resource for yourself in convincing yourself
Mhm.
of things that are true, or at least playing with the ideas of like testing your assumptions about what things are true, than um, trying to trick people into like
Yeah.
uh, believing something by winning arguments.
Mhm.
And that's it sounds like that sounds more malicious than I really think it ever is for people. But
Yeah.
I don't know, there's a lot of like a lot of my problems with some of these things that I participated in when I was an evangelical. It opens the door to certain things that
Mhm.
I don't know how healthy it is to have it so central to your participation in a spiritual world. And I don't know if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
No, I totally get it. Like what you said about the role of apologetics and conversion, and I think that is, it's a very evangelical idea to sort of do what it takes to convert, because you are moving that person's soul from hell into heaven.
Mhm.
And so there's this, close the deal. And it really, I think I've heard Paul use that language at one point. Um, but I think the value, especially good apologetics, and I would differentiate the two. Like to me, some of those like really well thought out, like William Lane Craig has a couple arguments that go back to like, Plato and the first mover. Like that's different from saying that, there were baby dinosaurs on Noah's Ark because the big ones wouldn't fit. Like that's, but I think to introduce those better ideas into the culture, even even if they're just in there to find for somebody who's questioning when they're searching on YouTube and they hear somebody, who's smart talk about these things, at least like it's not just you don't want them to deconvert. Hopefully they find this material. It's just like that's another seed they can have. They can carry that with them. And if they identify it as truth, like they're going to carry that with them as they explore, whatever, like you said, truth will shine no matter what. And it's, if you believe something that's not true, it's not even like it's bad. Like you want that taken away from you, as painful as it is, because it's going to make your
Right.
life a lot worse. It's going to be that much harder when you finally realize it's not true,
Right.
which, it will inevitably happen at some point. So I do really see the value in apologetics. And that was really, really influential in my Christian walk around the time that, we started getting interested in the more non-denominational stuff. Cause like I said, I came at it from a really analytical perspective. And so
Right.
I actually, like you, had to do a lot of research into like, logic, if A then B, and looking at, the way William Lane Craig formulates some of those things. I really do enjoy that stuff.
Yeah. William Lane Craig is a funny one. The first time I saw him in a conversation, I was like, this guy is annoying.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's just like,
He's a
I don't,
phenomenal
but
debater though. Like he's
it's
very good at what he does.
so good. I actually love him now. I think I don't know. I've just appreciated who he is, and like,
Yeah.
I've learned to recognize and the value he has. And yes, he's phenomenal at debating. And I think for him, what I really liked about William Lane Craig, because at this time it was like, whether I believe what he says or not, like he will walk me through his argument
Hmm.
line by line. And like, that's what I needed at that time, where it's like,
Yeah.
like he'll tell me what he believes and then walk me through it very clearly and concisely in this
Hmm.
like logical form. And there was a beauty to that. But I recognize why people don't like him, I guess. But
Oh yeah. No.
I think he's misunderstood more than he's an unlikable guy.
Yeah. No, I
um,
think so.
but where I started to kind of get worried about the apologetics, and I think I even found myself doing this a little bit, but I saw it becoming a project of like a Tower of Babel version of
Hmm.
building to God, where I take all of these arguments and I put them together and I build up to this version of God. And for me, I kind of always believed God was sort of outside of the box. Like
Hmm.
Donald Miller always says, like, we try to put God in a box and do 3 steps, but like he's always going to break our box. And like,
Yeah.
God is not a formula.
Yeah.
And that's where, seeing some people get really dive into that. It's like, how much of is it propositional versus
Yeah.
participating and letting those things work together? Like the propositional things in your mind are very helpful because you can hold on to those in moments of uncertainty, and it
Hmm.
helps you, it can help you participate better in the world. But if it's all propositional and building up to God without an equal, if not greater amount of
Hmm.
participation, you're really doing a disservice to what it is like live,
Yeah.
just period.
No, I 100%. That's really interesting. That connected a couple dots because, kind of like we mentioned earlier, this sort of enlightenment idea that the highest truth is propositional truth. If Christians are constructing this Tower of Babel to the highest propositional belief, it's really like home court advantage for naturalism, because you're already conceding that like this is the thing that's true. We're going after propositions. That's really interesting. I had never thought of it that way, but I think that's accurate. I
Yeah, it's like
100%.
we're fighting materialism and with a materialistic frame, even though we're not
Exactly. I said that to
materialists.
Paul. Yeah, 100%. That's exactly where, because it's the materialism is almost like an addenda, like it's stuck in, or the supernatural part is like we're living in materialism and then we're like sticking this Christian stuff onto it.
Well, materialism is so seeped in modernity.
Hmm.
And in the first episode of like the Lord of Spirits podcast, with Father Stephen DeYoung and Andrew Stephen Damick, they talk about it like we're all kind of recovering materialists,
Yeah.
like, as Orthodox Christians, but as Christians in general. And I recognize this, like, so like I resonated with it so deeply, because I was like,
Yeah.
man, I am acting as if I'm a materialist, even though I've
Hmm.
never in my life considered myself one. And that was the cognitive dissonance of what that does to me, and my participation was just really tiring. It made
Yeah.
me run around in circles. And that's where I start to kind of try to pivot and find a place for it, because I think there's a place for the logic and the rationalism.
Mhm.
But if it's not in its proper order, it's going to cause funkiness in
Yeah.
our thoughts and the way we participate. Because as much as we want to make rationality king, the truth is rationality is born out of irrationality. And we
Mhm.
can see that through like children
Yeah.
participate in the world. And then as they participate,
Yeah.
patterns start to form and they recognize,
Mhm.
and rationality is born. And the
Yeah.
Western world loves rationality. We don't want to be seen as irrational people, but
Yeah.
the truth is we are, and embracing that helps us think more rationally because we can put first things first.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I think they've done studies on that, the way we make decisions is very intuitive. Even the most, stone cold analytical person makes a fairly intuitive decision and then justifies it with the data.
Yeah.
I think most people make decisions that way. And like you said, we don't recognize that. That's one of the reasons I have this like idea that's starting to materialize, but I really want to start a podcast along like those same lines, centered around technology and the way
Yeah.
technology interacts with humanity. Because like the metaverse was this big thing that came, and it's interesting because nobody knows what to do with it. Like when you watch this, you think like, well, Mark Zuckerberg's a tool, but nobody knows like, what is this? Like, what do we do with this as a society? Is it good? Do we try to temper it? Do we do it in moderation? Like, what does all this stuff mean? And the people that are building these things are typically most of them are probably atheist or, at some level agnostic. And so these ideas are in a lot of ways baked into the technology that we use, whether we like it or not.
Right.
There's this sort of recognition, or really not recognizing meaning, but it's there. It's just, what is it? And
Yeah.
like I said, I'm trying to like, it's all this like nebulous, and I'm sure as a filmmaker, you've experienced this, like this nebulous sort of like in the ether ideas that are finally starting to like materialize a little bit. But it's been something I've been really interested in, and probably a project I want to pursue pretty soon, because it's just been on my mind.
Yeah, no, I think you should. And I mean, I've definitely been thinking a lot, especially lately, about technology and the place that it has in our lives and the way that it should be integrated. And I'm in a very weird position where through participation in social
Mhm.
media and the internet and all these things, I have, it has drastically changed my life and given me like the most beautiful things in the world.
Yeah,
Yet
right.
I recognize there are just so much limitations
Mhm.
and sort of distractions that keep you from living well. And
Mhm.
yeah, I'm in that place where it's like I can't quite opt out yet, but I have to
Yeah.
find a way to do it differently, or it's just gonna consume me.
Yeah.
um, and that's a whole nother conversation. But no, I think there's so much to be said about technology and how it has changed the way we participate in the world and the way that we're wiring, and kind of in the shape of my projects, like the way we consume. The 24-hour news cycle has changed the way that
Mhm.
we think and the way we believe we can come to good answers in such drastic ways that it's more harmful than good.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm just trying to kind of rethink all of that and recognize, hey, we can't, I don't think we can live without it. And I don't think opting out is actually the most beneficial way. But how do we break patterns? How do we break patterns and find the balance for us all individually? Because yeah, there's these algorithms that are designed to pull
Yeah.
us in and wire our brains a certain way. And
Yeah.
I truly believe that most of these big tech corporations who design the algorithms are doing it for the greater good. Whether they're good or not is debatable.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a huge conversation that needs to be had.
Yeah.
I don't think enough people are talking about it well, because it's like, look at all these things that happen in like technology and social media and how they change your brain. We should just opt out of it.
Exactly. It becomes almost like like an like a staticism, like, or almost like a psychological hygiene issue where you really just need to kind of rid yourself of these things or take a dopamine fast, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, like you said, those algorithms are the interesting piece of that too, is like, maybe they're for the greater good, or maybe they say they're for good, but some of these things just run their course. Like the
Mhm.
Facebook algorithm's a good example. So if you tasked the smartest artificial intelligence to maximize engagement between people, it's going to uncover, regardless of your input, it's going to uncover the fact that what makes people triggered is the thing that's going to get the most engagement. So then
Yeah.
all you do is say, let's maximize engagement. And then the output is everybody's like super
Outrage.
mad and really tribal, and,
Yeah.
we all hate each other. And it's really just like, I think it has to come down to virtue at a personal level in understanding some of those things. I mean,
Mhm.
everything's capitalist. It like it or not, like that's what Facebook is. That's what Google is. You can say, we're for the greater good. I guarantee if there's some, some project and there's a fork in the road, and they can say, this will make humanity a better, but it's going to cost, $100 billion, or we can go this way and we can make 20 billion, and there's probably really no bad consequences we can conceptualize right now. They're going to take the path that is good for the shareholders.
Yeah. Well,
And
yeah, especially if you have investors, it's much
yeah,
easier if you're like
exactly.
a sole proprietorship and
And they
you're
all
on your
do.
own boat. But
Yeah, and they all do, because in a capitalist society, we're going to select for the projects that have investors. And so you could have the smartest, most technically minded person come up with a technology that's unbelievably good for humanity, but it's not going to get venture capital, because it's not going to get it's just not going to get anywhere. You need the thing that's going to make the money. And that's where it's an interesting space where we're in. I
Mhm.
know there's an Elon Musk quote that I thought was really interesting. I don't know if you follow the Neuralink thing at all, but it's this idea of, they're working on a project which has some really interesting applications, but the idea is like you embed sort of a microchip in your brain, and then you can interface with the computer more quickly. So you could, down the road, you could do a Google search without thinking about, or you would just think about it. You wouldn't have to type it on your phone. So you could sort of wonder, what's the capital of Spain, and then you would sort of know the answer, that kind of thing. There's a lot
Okay,
of pushback against it.
I've heard a
And
little bit about it. Yeah.
the his argument for why this really isn't a big deal is because we're already cyborgs in a sense. And he's saying that if you have your phone in your pocket, if you live your life with your phone, now you're connected to this outside world. You do have access to this information real time, and you do have like essentially a superpower to, put your face and your ideas in front of, a million people right now if you really want to do that. But we have a slow connection between our brain and the internet, because it has to go through your thumbs and it has to go through the phone. And I think that's reasonable. It's a reasonable way to look at it. But what it discounts is the fact that when you're participating in that activity with your phone, you're also embodying the internet. Like, your
Sure.
phone's an extension of you, but now you're an extension of those algorithms that Facebook wants you to be a part of. And people completely discount that.
Right.
And the research shows that it's clearly true. I mean, when you look at like teenage mental health and things like that. But I think the conversation really should go deeper than just, this is bad for you, try to do it in moderation. I'm not a big social media person. I swear I do
Yeah.
YouTube. I have a YouTube channel in dentistry. I haven't done anything on it in a while, but YouTube seems different for me for some reason, like YouTube and podcasting, because you can be genuine, and you're not like, it's not like every day you're still trying to get attention, like
Right.
Instagramming your breakfast or whatever. I'm terrible at social media too. I'm like kind of a
Yeah.
boomer in that regard.
Well, I've been purposely bad at it for a while. I've been
Hmm.
playing around with certain social media platforms as ways of like deliberate practice, or um, kind of finding ways to embody um, my life in a more artistic way.
Hmm.
And I've also started using it as more of like a time capsule for myself
Oh, that's cool.
to like, because what I've realized is the times that I found most helpful when I've used Facebook is when I write posts about things that were big in my life, or
Oh,
little
that's
things
interesting. Yeah.
that like kept like that were meaningful to me. And then when I would look
Hmm.
back at them, like especially when I was deconstructing, I'd look back at some posts of like where I talk about my faith, and I go, man, I really believe
Hmm.
that truly when I
Yeah.
said that. And it's not that I don't now, but like, there's something about me that wouldn't say that now. And what is it? And
Hmm.
it just helps me audit myself. And so I've been trying to play in different ways there. And I don't know how long I'll do it, because I do think there's a lot of negatives about social media and what have you. But I think there is something, the way that Elon Musk was talking about it, where it's like, well, you already have this extension, but it's just slowing you down. There's something to me that's like, yes, it's good that it's slowing you down.
Exactly. Yeah,
And
exactly.
it's one thing to have a phone that you can leave at home, and I can walk out my door and I
Hmm.
can hop on my bike and I can go for an hour and not be around something tied to me, versus a chip in my head that I can't go like leave without. And I can think I can turn it off, but like, who knows what that even means?
Yeah.
Like, if you can really tap into things that way. I'm very hesitant about like the embodiment in such a full way. That's in some ways irreversible.
Yeah. I think, I mean, I would absolutely agree with that. I think there is, but it's an easy argument to make when your view of the world is enlightenment, rational materialism.
Yes, yes.
And the reason you can get away with saying such, you know, stupid things, frankly, is because the culture will accept it. And I think the metaverse, and I said this to Rachel, to my wife, that I think the metaverse is it's actually could be an opportunity, because like boiling a frog, the analogy is like, we're kind of little bit of technology now, we're Facebook and Instagram is getting worse now, TikTok, like that's awful, but little bits at a time. The metaverse is just such a profound leap in like how stupid this actually is, that it might make some people think like, wait a minute, what, I'm gonna like, my family's in the next room and I'm gonna put like a TV on my face and join these people that I've never met in a low poly bar or whatever. And so I think that I'm hoping humanity wakes up to some of this at some point, but I guess that remains to be seen, because I've been like, there are other moments where I'm like, yeah, this is stupid, people aren't going to go for this, and then they're like, wow, no, this, yeah.
I don't know. And to be honest, I don't know much about the metaverse. All I know is the memes I've seen.
Oh,
So
right, yeah,
it's sort of like, I can't even get my mind around like, wait, what is this thing?
yeah,
I don't, part of me doesn't want to know, because I'm
yeah,
afraid I'm going to be like, this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And like,
yeah.
just lose faith in humanity.
Have you used any virtual reality things, or like done any games or anything like that?
Not really. I'm trying to remember. I think maybe I've done something in like a
Yeah.
museum or something,
Oh,
but
interesting. Yeah.
not
The
not really.
somebody I really like is it's a his name is Jaron Lanier, and he was kind of like the guy that founded virtual reality, or one of the few. He's a really interesting guy in Silicon Valley, but his ex- description of virtual reality is the most magical moment of virtual reality is when you take the headset off and your brain has to get reaccustomed to how real the real world is. And it's
Mm.
just such an antithetical to this idea that we're all going to put this thing on our face and join this internet world, and people in the internet world. It's
Mhm.
such a different way to look at it that I'm really just really hoping people can kind of wake up to some of that stuff.
Well, I wonder if what we might need as a society is to dive into that, for that recognition of that real, like,
Hmm.
shattering of like the differences between this fake and this real world. And it's going to have real detriments, I think, because you blur those lines too much. It's the cognitive dissonance and the struggle of what it is to like find support, that people who can't really support you because they live thousands of miles away or what have
Hmm.
you. um, that's only sustainable for a time. And even sort of the online communities I'm a part of, they're beautiful, they're great, and I've made some of the best friendships I ever had from them, but they're not fully embodied. Like, the best way to like, I think truly the best way to kind of grow from that is like, okay, take the thing that you've learned there and bring it into your community, and like
Hmm.
find ways to make it tangible. Like, if you if you've connected with these people, find ways to meet them and like bring it
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
reality, because too far out of that, it just gets disconnected. And then even that, there's a certain level of which you have to take that thing that you've learned how to do on this space and make it tangible in your real life, because you can't be supportive by like network connections.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because it's filtered through the pipe of whatever's programmed. So whoever developed that platform, like the interactions you can have with each other are limited by the developer's perspective of what interaction should be. And so you're absolutely right, because when you meet somebody in person, there are so many intangible things, like just little body language things and stuff like that you just don't get even in even on like a video call or something like that. It's yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I really hope we don't lose that sense of, like, especially with all the COVID stuff, like
Yeah.
everything's shut down and we're supposed to believe that a video conference is the same as meeting somebody in person. And
Yeah, no, there's just, I hope that this sort of fear of others starts to melt away, because for me, I'm very much a people person. But I'm
Mhm.
just recognizing how dangerous that is in a world where, humans are meant to connect with other humans in community. And so if we're scared to even be in touch with someone because of like bodily
Mhm.
hazards that
Yeah.
may be dangerous to you, like that really breaks down this ability of community and makes us just retreat back to these internet worlds, which you can get really far. Like, I think you can get to know people really well and you can
Mhm.
really engage well. But again, it has its limitations. And you have to have that ability to take that and bring it into the real world. Otherwise, you're just disconnected from yourself completely. It's like
Mhm.
you have this world where you're this person and this world where you're like isolated and
Yeah.
disconnected. And I know, and it's hard because, and just kind of bring it back to where we started. Church used to be that place where you'd have the community
Yeah.
and you'd get
Mhm.
grounded. And as secularism rises and more people become non-religiously affiliated, they don't know where to go. They don't
Mhm.
have any place to tangibly find community. And for a lot of people, for whatever reason, experience, emotional issues, intellectual issues, they can't step into a church.
Mhm.
So it's like, where do you go?
Yeah.
Like, especially with these big questions, which I think a lot of people come to the internet to get them answered because they don't think they can do that in the community they're in, or at least they don't feel a safety to do that. And there's a lot more to lose doing it there.
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's just like they're floundering. And like, that's why I think the Estuary Project, defining neutral spaces where those people can come together and get grounded in a personal relational way that is in person, not just on the internet, um, is more necessary sort of in this cultural moment than ever before. And whether it will always be necessary, I don't know, but like there's something, I do think there's a certain necessity for it now.
Yeah, I think, like you said, the COVID stuff is really scary, because I was talking to Rachel about this too. It's like 5 years ago, if you saw somebody at the airport with a mask on, you'd get this visceral, like, oh, wow, like, stay away from that guy. What's wrong with them? And now here we are
Mhm.
5 years later. If you see somebody in the airport without a mask on, it's like, wow, no, get away from me. I don't know,
Well,
what's
there's two
going on.
sides,
And
right? You're either the best friend or you're like, they're
yeah,
killing
that's true.
humanity.
Yeah, that's true. Like, you can fist bump, and yeah, I get what you, yeah. Well, I think that's kind of the tribalism too.
Yeah.
But we're definitely being conditioned, whether intentional or not, to not want to be anywhere near each other and to substitute real relationships with virtual ones.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's like that was my biggest sort of struggle with the whole COVID conversation, the shutdowns. It's like, okay, let's say it's as deadly as we are assuming, which most people assumptions are higher than
Hmm.
normal of the death rates, but let's say it's as deadly as we're assuming. what is the trade-off for like the detriment we're making for relational connection and mental health,
Yeah.
stability that has the potential not only to lead to death, but just real dangerous situations for a lot of people, by not being able to have that connection because we're locked, we're self-isolating ourselves and locking ourselves in a jail of our own making. It's, to me, that was sort of more of the bigger issue. And then there's sort of this entrepreneurial business side of myself too, where it's like,
Yeah.
what are the consequences there, and what that means for a society as well. It just seemed very limited in the scope of what we were thinking about, consequences of this thing. And I don't have strong opinions about like legislation. I think everybody has just got to do what they can and what they feel morally okay with.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
there's definitely, I think, a lot more detriment and unintended consequences from all of this, that we haven't even started to see. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I have faith that it will ultimately lead to good, but it's hard to kind of look hopefully that everything, it'll be fine.
Yeah.
There's
Right.
going to be a lot of pain and a lot
Yeah.
of struggle in trying to reintegrate ourselves into what it means to like be in a society.
Yeah. That's really, it's going to be interesting, like especially for kids. Like I've got a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old, and they go to a school that does not have like real aggressive mask policies and stuff like that. Once in a while you see a kid with a mask because their parents wanted to wear it, but like in general, they haven't, have been required to wear a mask. And we get these emails all the time like, hey, someone in your kid's class had COVID, and so you might they're supposed to quarantine, or they don't have to, but just to let you know, you might want to do a rapid test or whatever. And I mean, it's just like, for us, it's just a cost of putting him back in school to be around other kids, because there's enough data coming out now. This has been 2 years. They're seeing already some really young kids, statistically, at least one study showed, and it's one study. I haven't really, looked into the data too much, but it was like, there's been an increase in the number of kids that have to go to speech therapy because they're not learning how to speak as well, because they can't see their teacher's mouth move when they're talking. And it just,
Wow.
like you said, just really unintended consequences. You don't get to see, you don't learn to read those facial expressions and facial cues in those formative years. It's all, and to couple that with the only outlet for that kind of expression is now electronic. So we're pushing kids further into that. It's really like, that was big for us. Like, we just want our kids to be around other kids and just make it as normal as possible. It's, it's generally pretty safe for kids, even if they get sick, which one of my kids so far has had COVID. And it is what it is.
Yeah. Well, it's been interesting too to see a lot of the kids. They pick up things very quickly. And so like the kids like recognizing the masks and even being afraid. Like I was with my nieces once, we were in Flagstaff or something at a pool, and there were kids like running away from other kids because it was like COVID. And it's like,
That's so sad.
it's so sad, but there's like, I wonder what it's going to do for like the neuroticism and this like sort of conditioning of like, you know, staying safe from germs at all costs and all of these things that have been like, and, I think there's a place for the conversation of how do we care for others well, and how do we respect others well. But I'm more libertarian at heart in general. It's the American Southwest in me.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep.
And so for me, it's finding ways to allow freedom for whatever choice you want to make. I respect the decisions and the conservative bent in trying to like be cautious with certain things, but I don't know. I do really wonder what it is doing to like society and social engagement, which I'm always very sensitive to.
Yeah. I get it. It's I just can't, it's almost like you wish you could see the future, but then you almost are glad that you can't, because in case this whole COVID thing gets worse or the lockdowns stay for the next, into the future, then it's almost like you wouldn't want to know.
Yeah, no, I've gotten to the place where it's like, I just need to get really good at being present because
Hmm.
I'm such a long-term thinker and a planner, and my brain just goes crazy being like the what ifs of, is this going to
Yeah.
stay in like lockdown and all of these things. And so I mean,
Hmm.
like, just be present and like try to live the best I can now.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. I think the best thing you can do, like, to fight it is just live the way you want to see
Hmm.
life be participated, like,
Yeah.
as a whole. And so that's always going to morph and change as you grow and learn. But yeah, I don't know. It's there's definitely a lot of opportunity open for, change and conversation. Um, and I think, as much as the loudest voices are the most divisive, I think
Hmm.
there's far more people in the middle, and in places like the places we find ourselves, where people are
Yeah.
actually having genuine, better conversations.
Hmm.
And over time, I think the dead wood will
Yeah.
burn off, the outrage will fall, and more sensible, more sensible, balanced conversation will rise, because it's more valuable in the long term.
Yeah. Well, here's hoping that's the case, because we definitely need that.
Yeah. Well, man, this has been a lovely conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming. Is there anything else you want to add before we kind of wrap up the recording?
Not really. I think we've covered, so much
covered a
stuff.
lot.
This was really a blast.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for, talking with me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much for watching. Like always, I will close with the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.